So what are the weakest units for every army in Warhammer 40K? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about some weaker units and other things that are at the lower end of the Warhammer 40k power spectrum, with a look through each faction in turn, and some of the units that perhaps most need improvement relative to their peers. In general, I feel like throughout 10th edition Games Workshop hasn't done too bad a job of trying to give boosts to the things that need it most in game, though I certainly would say that some factions have fared a lot better than others with that. Several of them have had repeated buffs for the units that got played the least, whereas some things have languished in a state of just not being played very much for a very long time. For this one I thought we'd talk through each faction in the game, talk about one unit in a bit more detail that I think maybe has a good argument to be the faction's weakest, but then also mention a few other things as well that are perhaps on a similar sort of power level. For this video I'm largely not going to mention things like flyers, fortifications and Forge World units in too much depth. Particularly for flyers and fortifications, the only thing that Games Workshop seems to do with those is to nerf them further. They've basically decided that they're just not really too bothered about balancing them and kind of want them out of the competitive game for the most part, maybe trying to promote armies that interact with each other in a slightly more normal way. I think it's reasonable enough to exclude them as a result, otherwise this would be a list that mainly just consisted of them. In any case though, let's talk through each faction in the game, talk about one unit that I consider fairly underpowered, and a few competitors that might also rival them for the crown of the weakest of the faction. Starting out with the Imperium and the core Space Marines, I still feel like the Reaver Lieutenant perhaps has one of the biggest claims to fame as one of the single least played datasheets. He's 55 points, so a fairly cheap support character, and gives lethal hits to his unit, plus terror troops out to a bigger range, so the Reavers can debuff things a little bit more easily. He can't deep strike though, which means that he can't go with the Reavers if they're using their grav shoots, which I kind of feel like might be the better option out of the two anyway. And I feel like characters in Reaver squads might be throwing more points after bad points in the first place. They're not really going to be doing any major damage anyway with their AP0 weapons for the most part, and lethal hits isn't really going to turn them around, I don't think. They're basically a unit that's very rarely played in themselves. I think are a contender for the title of the weakest unit for the Space Marines. But even then, if you wanted a leader for them, you'd likely go for the Phobos Lieutenant, who gets to do his move shoot move thing. I think that's just so much more useful, as well as the lethal hits, and he can even deep strike. I guess this guy might be a bit more tempting in Hounds of Mordkai maybe, but even then he has a bit of anti-synergy with their devastating wounds. Otherwise, beyond the Reavers, I feel like the Desolation Squad are worthy of a mention. Just spectacularly overcosted after starting the edition as perhaps one of the most powerful units in the game. The standard Dreadnought has got kind of poor stats for the cost, and I feel like his aura of reroll ones to hit for infantry isn't enough to make up for that. And if I was to include flyers and fortifications, then the Stormhawk and Stormtalon and the Hammerfall Bunker would both likely make the list as well. Next up for the Adeptus Mechanicus, I'm a bit less sure about them compared with the majority of units out there. They have been kind of radically overhauled with big points changes and also big buffs, and it's going to be interesting to see what shakes out as good. I feel like outside of their Cybernetica detachment, the Castellan robots didn't really do too well out of the recent update though. 190 per two of them, and they weren't really being played in competitive lists at 180, and unlike the rest of the army, they didn't actually get any boosts to the unit either out of datasheet changes or the new Doctrina imperatives, as they can't take those outside of Cybernetica cohorts. I do think that they got far better in that one with the new Assault one on the go, but basically outside of that they kind of got a nerf in the last update, going up in cost, and that's kind of bad for a unit that was rarely played already, particularly when quite a lot of other units got interesting buffs. Otherwise the Archaeopters I think would pip them to the post if flyers were counted. Otherwise it will be interesting to see what makes the cut or doesn't after the new points and the rules changes. I'm still maybe a bit sceptical as to whether or not Belisarius Core is quite worth it, even with the buffs that he got. I have seen at least one competitive list running him though. Next up for Sisters of Battle, the Dogmata for 45 points does seem to stand out from the rest. She really was a datasheet that probably needed a bit more help out of the codex, particularly when so many other things got special rule rewrites. She gives +1 objective control to her unit, a -1 leadership debuff, and some strength 5 and damage 2 melee. I feel like that's just really not enough when she's competing against excellent HQs like Palatines and Canonesses for first choice, and good support characters as well. The OC and the leadership both kind of need a sister squad to survive on the front line right next to the enemy, and they tend to be a bit fragile to do that for the most part. Otherwise, for units that feel a bit overshadowed right now, I feel like maybe Repentia and the Celestian Sacrosancts might be a bit further down there. Repentia are just spectacularly costed at 90 points these days, even if they are dangerous. Feels like they just might not be quite worth it outside of Penitent Host. And Sacrosancts still maybe feel just a little bit overcosted for what they do. They are an interesting unit that can take character buffs quite well, but I'm not sure if they're quite tanky enough or dangerous enough. For the Adeptus Custodes, the Knight Centura at 70 points I think is arguably their weakest datasheet in the Codex. She makes her squads move around a bit faster, which can be nice to deliver vigilators to close combat, and then can cause problems with the opponents falling back if they've charged them and locked them in close combat. In general though, that feels incredibly underwhelming for 70 points. I feel like she could be a good 20 points less or so. I think she's only really all that useful if you need something to bear a Normaiden Task Force enhancement perhaps. It certainly feels like a far secondary choice versus Alea with her fights first. Otherwise, I still think that a fair few of the Forge World units are kind of underwhelming, even if a few things got some points cuts. And out of the core codex, the Virtus Praetors are still pretty overcosted in comparison with the infantry. Maybe not enormously so, but could still do with a comparative points decrease. For the Grey Knights, I'd likely give it to the Servitors for 50 points. Previously, they might have been a bit more justifiable for actions and things, though it's not like Grey Knights tended to have enormous problems with that with all their teleporting. Objective Control 0, though, just means they're not particularly good for actions or objectives anymore, and they're really quite fragile for the cost, and don't really make up with it in damage with a couple of multi-melter hits on average. If you wanted a small unit like that, I feel like Void's Men-at-Arms or the Inquisitorial Henchmen would do better out of the Agents of the Imperium. Otherwise though, besides them, I feel like the flyers like the Stormhawk and Stormtalon would also be worthy of consideration as well, not really fitting in with the Grey Knight's way of making war. And perhaps for more on-the-ground units, perhaps the Razorback and Venerable Dreadnought are on a similar sort of level. The Razorback is quite cheap, but often a bit niche given that you don't really need it so much with teleporting units jumping around the place. And the Venerable Dreadnought does have a good buffing aura with some reroll ones for infantry, but it's also very expensive for whatever else it brings at 155 points. For the Imperial Knights, out of the core index units, I'd likely rate the Knight Preceptor and Knight Valiant as the two most niche variants. The Knight Preceptor at 405 points just feels massively inferior to Canis Rex himself. He loses the Storm Spear squad and the ability to mark a unit for some personal rerolls, but what he gains is far better, getting weapon skill and ballistic skill 2+ with sustained hits 1 on a 5+, so just enormously more melee damage and damage out of that Las Impulsor, and also gets free stratagems and Sir Hector getting out as well. The Knight Preceptor's objective control rule I think is kind of a niche one as well, usually a bit too much so to matter. Beyond all that, I wouldn't say that the Las Impulsor's damage output is particularly impressive compared with the other Knight weapon choices, definitely not awful, but doesn't really feel standout. Otherwise, I feel like the Knight Valiant is the other one maybe vying for the bottom spot, just getting way worse after it couldn't Overwatch anymore. That still feels like it's needed a good points drop ever since that was taken away from it. It just doesn't really feel like it's got enough reward for having to get so close to deal its damage. If you're looking at Forge World Knights, I'd probably rate the Acheron the worst out of them. Similar kind of issues to the Valiant, and its gun is just kind of weak in general for a big knight. For the Astra Militarum, I might be tempted to rank the Servitors here again, similar to the Grey Knights. Their version a worse ballistic skill, but 35 points, though we've kind of talked about them with the Grey Knights. Outside of them, I feel like the Deathstrike missile launcher is still far overcosted at 145. This one keeps its kind of curious targeting special rule where you put a marker down on the board, then the opponent can move out the way if they can, and then you can choose whether or not to fire the missile. Unfortunately, I feel like most of the time if the opponent can move all bar one unit away, then that single unit that's left isn't really going to care too much about being hit by the missile if it wastes an entire 145 point unit's main purpose. You could easily just kill something like one Terminator or like 5 cultists or so, which isn't exactly worth it to the owner of the Deathstrike. Otherwise, the Ogren Bodyguard and Nork Deadog are kind of rarely played, given that they're just extra points thrown into a big unit that isn't usually intending to get into close combat. I feel like maybe there's a few of the Baneblade chassis that are a bit underwhelming compared with some of them, perhaps a bit of redundancy there. Otherwise, if flyers and fortifications would count, then the Valkyrie and the Aegis line would be worth talking about, I think, particularly the Aegis line, given how expensive it is. Finally, for the Imperium, let's talk about a few of the Divergent Space Marine chapters. For the Blood Angels, Death Company Tycho is 90 points. And it just seems kind of weird that he is so much more expensive than the regular version. Really weak melee for a Blood Angels character. He does allow you to advance and charge, which I guess is nice for threat range, but I feel like for 90 points that's not really enough, particularly as he doesn't really buff your unit in other ways, such as a Chaplain could. I feel like he stands out as kind of head and shoulders worse than the rest of the Blood Angels. For the Black Templars, I'd kind of say that none of their unique units are outright bad. All their unique named characters and the 2 variants of Crusader Squads and Sword Brethren are all fine. Most of the tanks quite like having the multi-melter for the extra 10 points. Maybe the Templar Repulsor is a bit notable as it now pays 20 points over the regular version now. Might mean that it's a tiny bit weaker, but in reality I feel like it's still not the worst trade-off in the world. And otherwise I guess you could look at their Castellan and Marshal. Basically versions of the Space Marine Captain and Lieutenant, but with worse war gear options, not able to take things like Power Fists or Storm Shields on the Lieutenants. It does maybe feel like splitting hairs a little bit though, given that they're more sort of variants of the core Codex Space Marine datasheets, even if they might be a little bit inferior. For the Dark Angels, I've chosen to rank the Land Speed of Vengeance at 140 points. This thing has still needed an enormous points cut ever since its damage went down from 3 to 2. For 140 points, that's about the same as you could get a lot of battle tanks out there. You get D6 plus 1, Strength 9, AP 3 and Damage 2 shots with Twin Links, and that's just not really enough for such an expensive vehicle that isn't really all that tough to take down. A special rule to be able to shoot the enemy back when things die nearby is kind of fun, but it might not trigger every game, and the Land Speed of Vengeance might just get shot down first. Otherwise, I feel like both of their planes are really quite costly, as with flyers most of the time in 40k, and it was a bit disappointing Games Workshop didn't give some of their named characters a bit more fun stuff. I feel like Ezekiel, Belial and Asmodai are all kind of niche, and their rules just aren't really very exciting much more than the generic characters. For the Death Watch, they have been kind of neglected recently. Discounting looking at any of their flyers like the Corvus Blackstar, maybe the Fortis Kill Team could be worth talking about. I do feel like they're in quite a bad place, particularly now things like Hellblasters and Outriders went down in cost so much. They're still 115 points per 5 or 230 per 10. Basically the same price as the Hellblaster squad, except you don't get the Shoots on Death rule and you get half the Plasma Incinerators. And you can take a couple of the units as Outriders, but even these aren't actually saving you that many points versus how much you can buy them in for individually in their own unit now. Just really quite clearly an overcosted squad by any measure really, and even their special rule isn't particularly interesting, being a damage buff against heavily depleted units, which most of the time on average doesn't tend to be what you're firing at. Captain Artemis I think also is worthy of a mention here as well. 65 points for a character that does do a little bit of damage, but isn't really much good besides his stands back up on death rule. He basically lost half of his stratagem rule in the balanced data slate, though I didn't think it was particularly enormously impactful before, to be honest. Just seems to add far less than, say, a normal captain or lieutenant would. Finally, for the Space Marine chapters, we've got the Space Wolves. I feel like they've really got quite a few slightly niche character choices out there. Maybe Lucas the Trickster could be one of the examples of one that's really quite rarely played. He's only 50 points, so he's quite cheap and gives -1 to hit for his units, then a few scrappy lightning claw attacks, and a slightly unreliable chance to do some mortal wounds if slain in melee. Just seems super low on the priority list for characters that you might buy in, versus quite a few of the other Space Wolf ones which are fairly good. There are a few other characters I'd consider kind of niche, but looking outside of them, the Venerable Dreadnought I think pays really quite a bit for its price, even if it does have a kind of interesting reroll rule for infantry near it, and as per most other armies, the Flyers are kind of overcosted. Moving on to the Forces of Chaos, and I feel like they have quite a lot of units to talk about here. Games Workshop don't seem to have done quite as well at trying to help out the weaker stuff when they redid the Codex. Not sure if you'd necessarily rank the Lord Discordant in terms of literally the weakest model out of there, but it certainly felt like one of the most obviously overcosted ones. Ever since 10th edition came out, neither particularly dangerous nor particularly tough for his cost, and nothing to stop him getting shot before other things. Maybe Games Workshop feeling like they sold enough of these in 8th and 9th edition. On top of that, his vehicle debuff style rules are very matchup dependent, and he didn't even get the vehicle keyword for the Soulforged hunting pack, so you can't really use any of the synergies out of that, which was a shame. Otherwise though, I feel like there's really quite a lot of options that you could have argued to be worse than him. The Traitor Enforcer for the Traitor Guardsman with his Ogrin. They give free Overwatch and don't have terrible melee stats for a character, but at the same time it's really not what you want to lead a Guardsman squad most of the time. Spawn now that OC0 might be fighting for the crown as well. Neither particularly tough or dangerous, nor can hold objectives, and again seem like they're just a bad deal versus all the various flavours of cultists they can get. The Felgor Ravager Beastmen still cost a lot for their first turn reserve arrival, though at least that does add a bit of interest, and as ever, flyers and fortifications don't look so great either. The Helldrake's overcosted in any codexes that it features in, and the Noxolith Crown pays a whole load of points for essentially a leadership buff aura. For the World Eaters, Games Workshop does seem to have made it so all their unique stuff is genuinely pretty playable and strong. I feel like if I had to pick one unique datasheet, then it might be either Khan or the Juggernaut Lord maybe, but I feel like both of those are still very usable. Otherwise, it's looking at the generic Chaos Space Marine datasheets. Obviously Helldrakes have been mentioned if aircraft were counted, but otherwise I feel like there's just quite a lot of stuff that's pretty mid out of their generic datasheet options. The Predators and Forge Fiends don't get nasty Dark Pact sort of buffs like they do in Chaos Space Marines. In particular, I feel like that means that the Predator tanks are really quite underwhelming compared with elsewhere, and for other units that rarely see play, the Defiler is one of the ones that very rarely gets selected. I think in general people just consider 190 points too much for what he brings to the table, even if he is sort of okay in defence, has a bit of shooting, and has got some okay melee against heavies. I think I'd likely weigh up between him and the Predators. I feel like they do a little bit of firepower if you need it, but don't really get any synergy with the rest of the codex at all given that it's all melee related. For the Chaos Demons, I feel like Games Workshop have repeatedly trimmed points costs on some of their weakest units, so that quite a lot of their more mainstream units are actually fairly playable. Even in their character section, I feel like you could make arguments for quite a few of them, though perhaps a few of them stick out as a bit weaker than most. Maybe one example could be the Changecaster for the Pink Horrors. 60 points for sustained hits for a horror unit just seems like a lot, really. It's not really going to be enough to turn them into a major threat of a unit, and otherwise it's just got a little bit of personal psychic shooting with a smite type attack, plus handing out a battle shock test. If he wants to actually make his shooting kind of good with the focus witchfire sort of mode of it as well, then he's also got to risk exploding himself too hazardous. Overall, just doesn't seem to be anywhere near enough to justify 60 points. Otherwise, perhaps out of the Demon HQs, the Sloppity Bile Piper again feels like he's pretty low down the priority list. Plague Bearers often just tend to be a bit of a tar pit unit that can sit on objectives and score them and be tough and cheapish, so maybe not really the sort of thing that you want to buy in additional characters for, and he doesn't really give all that much to them, a small movement boost, and again doing battle shock type things. I feel like most of the fortifications, if you wanted to count them, would probably also make the list as well, and probably be even worse than these. For the Thousand Suns, like the World Eaters, I feel like Games Workshop again have done a good job of making all their unique units pretty usable. And again, if we counted flyers, I feel like Helldrake would be in the running here to win. Pretty much overcosted for the damage they do wherever they're found. Otherwise, maybe a bit like the World Eaters, I feel like they've got quite a lot of generic Chaos Marine vehicle choices that might vie for the spot a little. The Predator tanks just don't really play into their core strategy all that much, even if their heavy bolter sponsons get a bit better here. The Defiler's just an okay generalist, the same as the World Eaters. The Land Raider kind of suffers for things that it wants to transport in Thousand Suns. I guess you could do Scarab Occult Terminators, but in general they could be far easier moved around the board by teleporting them or the Umbrellific Crystal. I feel like the Hellbrute is pretty underwhelming as well. I know he generates some Cabal points, but it kind of forces you to castle up and build the rituals around it, and otherwise you just don't get particularly impressive stats for the cost. For the Chaos Knights, I feel like they're in the position where most of the big knights don't really get played at a competitive level very much, but I feel like most of them are pointed at the place where they're usable in more casual games at least. Maybe none of the core index ones really sticking out as truly terrible, even if they're not going to make appearances in optimised lists very much. Out of the big knight options, I think I'd debate between the Knight Tyrant and the Knight Abominant. I feel like it might be actually kind of closer now, given the Abominant is quite as cheap as it is. Previously I think that would have won it outright, but overall I think I could have happily picked either of them for the top spot here. The Knight Tyrant definitely does have some good things. The Dark Flame version is less favoured as it can't overwatch anymore, the same as the Imperials, but the more Castellan Pasm one with the Volcano Lance and the Ectoplasma, that certainly is a big scary gun turret that the opponent might struggle to deal with. Perhaps its main issue is that it's just not quite as reliable as the Imperial version of it. That one getting some very nasty inbuilt rerolls for the Volcano Lance and just makes that far more threatening against enemy tanks and vehicles. Otherwise it is quite tanky and it could take that AP debuff enhancement just to make it spectacularly hard to kill. And its Deny Deep Strike aura I think is genuinely quite useful, means that opponents won't be able to just drop things right next to it onto an objective or anything like that and count as 3-inch deep strike things, which isn't too bad for knights. Despite that though, I still think it just pays a bit too much for its abilities at 510. I haven't seen anyone use one of these in a successful competitive list in a very long time. Otherwise, for the big knights, I still feel like the Abominant is going to be low down the list. It's just not quite as general purpose, a big damage threat for the big points investment. The Volkite can do well, but is pretty unreliable with that low AP and dependence on devastating wounds. And its melee is good against elite infantry, but far less so against really tough stuff with T10 or better. I could have happily also ranked the Abominant as the main pick for this one, and maybe out of the Forge World ones, the Acheron once more does feel like it's one of the most underwhelming ones there. I guess Battle Shock things are a bit better in Chaos versus Imperial, but having to coordinate with War Dogs for them to do so is a bit annoying. Finally for Chaos we've got the Death Guard. I feel like again, as with Thousand Sons and World Eaters, Games Workshop have kept the focus on making their unique units good. Compared with those, I feel like at least their Hellbrutes can do some useful things, handing out the contagions at long range, say to give AP-1 against a far-flung target. And Predator Destructors tend to get played really quite a lot given the AP debuff that they can access. Beyond that though, again I might be most tempted to talk about things like the Predator Annihilator and the Defiler. Not unplayable, but generally considered to be the lower end of the power spectrum for Death Guard. I'm still a bit skeptical about things like the Plague Surgeon and the Noxious Blightbringer being the right choice given their special rules. They did go down in points in the last update, but the Plague Surgeon is still very dependent on a Plague Marine squad being damaged but not destroyed, and even then you could be resurrecting some fairly cheap models that might struggle to justify as points cost. And the Noxious Blightbringer's speed boost and Battle Shock things maybe aren't the worst deal in the world at 45 points, but again I feel like most people are going to take the more powerful and impactful support characters even if they cost a little bit more. Otherwise, miasmic malignifiers are probably worth a shout on the fortification side of things, like many of them just being very costly for what they bring. Finally, getting into the ranks of Xenos, we have the Aeldari. Games Workshop did give a few points cuts to a few of their more niche units, like Howling Banshees recently, otherwise I feel like they might have featured here. For the Aeldari choice though, I decided to go for the Shadow Seer, basically giving stealth and advance and charge to a Harlequin unit. From the way that it's worded though, it looks like the advance and charge buff has to be cast in the movement phase, and as a unit ability that would mean that you can't be inside a transport, which I think is kind of a big deal seeing as Harlequin troops often seem to go charging out of Wave Serpents, say if they're being accompanied by Ivrain. On top of that, they've just not really got all that much personal threat, and just maybe feel like they're paying a bit more for what they do, and not working with transports is a bit rough if you really want your Harlequins protected against enemy fire until they get to charge in. Otherwise, if fortifications counted, then the Webway Gates will win this pretty easily. The Hemlock Wraithfighter is probably worth mentioning if we're counting aircraft at all. And otherwise, for rivals for actual units, I feel like Warlocks are particularly underwhelming at the moment, as are the Corsairs of both types. I feel like there's just lots of other good choices to rival them, particularly with things like Guardians having gone down, if you did want something to rival them for their higher objective control role. For the Drukhari, I've chosen to give this one to the Hellions. For an index that otherwise feels like it's really quite balanced, they just feel like they're maybe a little bit surprisingly overcosted for what they bring. They're not really particularly tough with their 2 wound skyboards with a bunch of strength 4 AP-1 damage 2 attacks and a little bit of splinter fire. It just feels like they're not really in the best place, still having to go around terrain as they have the mounted keyword, and not getting the scary attacks that can affect some high save targets like the Reavers have. Reavers just feel like they might be the better option for the fast Outrider unit sort of role, given that they move a bit quicker and also come in less expensive units so are a bit more expendable. And both of those units maybe feel a little bit more niche than some in the Sky Splinter, given that they don't use transports, so are locked out of quite a lot of the supporting rules from that. Overall, I feel like Hellions might be one of the units that can most afford to go down in points a bit in the Drukhari index. Otherwise, for closer competitors, I feel like the Succubus is still a little bit niche, as are the Homunculi and Yuri and Rakarth not being super exciting for the racks and things. And the Razorwing Jet Fighter still feels like it's a bit behind the Void Raven, even with the points differential. For the Tyranids, again it'd likely be Flies and Fortifications if they counted. Harpies and Hive Crones are both really overcosted, as is the Spore Assist. Outside of those though, then perhaps the Mucilid Spore and the regular Spore Mine Squad might be rivaling for the crown. Basically little more than cheap placeholder type units that are really easy to kill but can do a little bit of disruption, slowing down any advances I guess, and then they're unlikely to even recoup their points cost if they survive to make it into combat and explode. It just seems a bit weird that the payoff in mortal wounds for getting them close to the enemy doesn't really seem to be enough to justify their existence in the first place. Overall, still just much better to use a Biovore for 50 points to sit in the backfield and throw out Spore Mines for board control if you want them. They can't do as many secondaries as they used to, but they can still do some. And that just feels like the better overall deal, both having a screening backfield unit and also generating multiple of these over the course of the game. Besides the living bombs though, maybe things like the Toxicrene and the Hive Guard might have been ones to focus on besides them. Neither of those tend to get taken very regularly in optimised lists at all. Hive Guard just don't really compare against the bigger shooting monsters very well at all. And Toxicrines are good against their favoured infantry targets, but aren't really good against the more general field where they might not always be fighting those. For the Genestealer Cults, Games Workshop still seem to have made the majors to be particularly standout weak. They can hand out a -1 to hit debuff and a 5+ feel no pain against Psychic, plus just a little bit of melee attacks, and between the lot of that it just doesn't really add up to being 50 points worth of value, particularly given how character heavy Genestealer Cults can be and having so much competition. For more mainline units, maybe things like the Jackals and Aberrants feel a bit overcosted outside of their intended detachments, and the Goliath Rock Grinder still doesn't seem to fit in amazingly well with their overall strategy. For the Greenskins, I've chosen to give it to Tank Busters, 110 points for literally just 5 Orc bodies. It's kind of crazily fragile, and they definitely don't have the damage to make up for that. They need to be outside of a transport vehicle to make use of their anti-vehicle type special rules to have them be halfway decent, and even then they aren't really a very efficient or focused squad, as they're locked into their slightly eclectic mix of war gear, one taking the rocket pistols and one taking the tank hammer to represent their Finecast kit. At 110 points, it sort of feels like the kind of points cost that Games Workshop is deliberately trying to keep niche for them. Maybe not wanting to draw too much attention to the one kit they've not got around to updating from Finecast yet. Otherwise, Flyers and Fortifications would still be ranking here as well. The Big Head Boss Bunker and most of the Flyers, particularly the Bombers, are overcosted for what they do. And otherwise, the things I'd be most tempted to talk about might be some of the Buggies as well. I feel like they didn't do super well out of the Codex update, kind of having the same sort of stats. Maybe just be a little bit disappointingly low threat for the models that they are. For the Leagues of Votann, they don't have the biggest roster in the world, though I feel like Games Workshop have managed to keep the vast majority of units really quite playable. I'll still probably rank Uthar the Destined in first place for weakest unit right now, though even he is definitely not awful for 80 points. It's certainly unusually tough to kill, reducing the damage of attacks down to damage 1, and his rule to flip a dice to a 6 each turn is fairly impactful as well, can just chip away with some mortal wounds. Versus the Carl, I think his biggest disadvantage is that he doesn't actually have a damage buff rule to the unit that he's running with, maybe making him less attractive for really big Hearthguard squads, and isn't quite as cheap, effective and scary in combat as the Iron Hair Champion, who could also take enhancements if you wanted. I think at 80 points though is not really outright bad anymore. Otherwise, for their more mainline units, I'd probably rank Hearthkin Warriors and Chthonian Berserks as perhaps some of the more niche ones. Perhaps the Grimnir as well, given that the Hearthkin got a little bit cheaper. I feel like all of those are still absolutely usable in competitive lists though. And at the moment I feel like Games Workshop have done quite well to keep the Leagues of Votann well balanced with their different unit choices. Next up we've got the Necrons, and I feel like their Obelisk is almost always destined to take pride of place here. Basically just a great big tough super heavy that is genuinely kind of annoying to kill, but also doesn't do very much. It slows down a unit within 18 inches, and then has some Tesla spheres to do some volume fire against enemy infantry. But with the way that the points are costed at the moment, it just makes so much more sense to upgrade to either the Monolith or the Tesseract Vault, both of which are still very tanky super heavies, but can actually destroy some big enemy stuff as well. It just feels like if you're taking one of these, it's sort of a no-brainer to upgrade to one of the others. Otherwise, there are a few things that have felt like they've needed some help for a long time now. Triarch Praetorians just cost too much for what they do. Trazyn the Infinite still feels like a bit of a loss of a special character, which is kind of annoying given that he is such a cool character from the lore. The Triarch Stalker still feels like a bit of a slightly confused scout walker that doesn't really want to be too close to the enemy. Might be okay if you're lining up quite a lot of Necron shooting on targets though, I guess. And Crypto Thralls are just a bit too expensive to be chaff nuisance units and don't really have much durability to their unit either. 60 points just seems far too much to consider them. Finally we've got the Tau Empire, where again I'd say that the majority of the units are genuinely quite usable. Perhaps the Tide Wall fortifications stand out as particularly bad, but given that we're not talking about fortifications or flyers here, maybe the Firesight team might be worthy of a mention. They are a cheap lone operative that can do a little bit of backfield screening and also do a bit of guiding and contribute a few sniper shots, so I feel like they're not completely useless. but given that you can access good lone operatives like Shadow Sun, Ghost Kills, or the Kroot Lone Spear, I feel like most lists aren't going to consider them too hard. Otherwise, the Storm Surge just doesn't compete enormously well against all the other tower damage dealers out there. Also suffers from the whole guiding rules, meaning that if you split fire, then your ballistic skill gets worse, which is kind of a big negative when it's got so many guns. And otherwise, I guess some of the Kroot characters outside of the hunting pack, I feel like you'd rarely ever want to take them. Things like the War Shaper and Flesh Shaper in particular. In reality, maybe they could have ranked first here, but it does maybe feel like they're just very much intended for their own detachment as opposed to being a majorly good thing for the tower themselves. In any case though, with the Xenos armies rounded up, I think I'll leave this one there for today. Let me know your thoughts as to the choices and what units you would rate as the weakest for your factions out there. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and the reasoning down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.